At the close of our previous encounter with South American civilizational history, we met two notable cultures. There were the mummy-burying Paracas in the Ica region of modern-day Peru, and then up north, overlapping with where the Moche would soon arise, we'd seen the emergence of warlike settlements near a number of rivers. Our journey today will look at both of those regions and beyond, starting with the culture following the Paracas in the Ica region, a culture influenced by the former Paracas, the famed Nazca. Nazca culture bears clear imprints from their Paracas predecessors, though the Nazca farmed more effectively and lived more inland than their Paracas counterparts and correspondingly relied on a sophisticated irrigation system, constructing stone-lined channels to transfer water from aquifers to their farms and to their water reservoirs. For accessing the underground water channels, there were made descending stone-walled spiral paths. As Paracas sites were being abandoned around 100 BC, Nazca sites are growing and the Nazca story beginning. Like we've seen with the Paracas, the Nazca leave us deformed, elongated skulls, as well as skulls that have boreholes in them, that is, they're trepanated, sometimes more than once. Their textiles show some similar iconography, and in furtherance of a prior ceramic of the Paracas, the Nazca produced many double-spouted stirrup vessels. Nazca pottery depicted numerous forms, including many human, animal, and plant forms, and often a human and animal mixed feature creation. This bowl and double-spouted bottle both depict birds, with the bottle showing long-beaked hummingbirds feeding on two flowers. Whatever the hummingbird's significance, it seems relevant to mention the fact that the largest geoglyph the Nazca left us is that of the tiny hummingbird. The bird depicted here is less friendly and seems to have just gotten done with decapitating a person. Primary figures in Nazca burials are wrapped in textiles, and loose skulls accompanying them are a common feature. And in Nazca art in general, loose heads are something to keep an eye out for, and they often appear sometimes where you might not reflexively expect it. As mentioned, farming was important to the Nazca. They lived in pit homes within small villages and primarily ate corn, squash, sweet potatoes, and manioc. Other crops included coca, the San Pedro cactus, and cotton. Beyond the villages, there was also a large ceremonial center site for pilgrimage, Kawachi. In Kawachi are found offerings of food, textiles, and shells, as well as pottery that had come from a fairly wide area. Kawachi is also home to hundreds of mounds, many of which are sculpted hills. Though seafood was less important now, marine creatures are normal in their art, which brings me back to the loose heads where you might not expect them. You see on one side here a shark-like creature empty-handed and whose teeth have nothing to indicate blood on them. Turn to the other side and in the hand of this shark is a decapitated head, and notice how the teeth have red spots on them, perhaps reflecting the shark's method of decapitation. Here are some other examples of pottery depicting animals, and then there are these whiskered semi-feline entities. Other pottery took, to greater and lesser extents, the form of the figure attempting to be depicted, such as here with monkeys and a killer whale. Here's a bottle depicting a dog with the head included as part of the shape. And finally, let's take a look at a couple of birds. Shifting now to some vegetation ceramics, there's this vessel in the shape of a cornstalk, perhaps meant to hold corn beer in. And let's take a moment to look at a couple of other examples of vegetation depictions. Finally, let's look at some pottery showing human or humanoid features, starting with these figure bottles. This figure bottle depicts a warrior holding a decapitated head, and other loose heads line the lower register on the other side of the bottle. This figure has a snake coming down from his chin, as well as down the back of his head, and his eyes are framed by killer whales. This dude also has snakes coming down, There are flying figures reminiscent of the flying figures we've earlier seen from textiles of the Paracas. The Nazca have nice textiles as well, and they often used a tighter weave than their predecessors. One side of this bag shows 4 snake heads emanating or surrounding a large-headed figure, while the other side has a double-sided snake with 2 lone heads below. This fragment clearly shows 2 whiskered feline beings, perhaps humans in costume, each holding a head and having a head coming off their tails. The third figure, whose face we can't see, is holding a nice accessory for decapitating heads, a Toomey knife. While the Nazca left their artistic handiwork on their pottery and textiles for us to now see, they also deemed it appropriate, for unclear reasons, perhaps at times related to pilgrimage paths, to incise long lines in the sand. On flat, high plains covered with darker rocks and reddish soil, the Nazca dug many lines into the lighter, whitish sand beneath. Some of these lines were just that, straight lines. Others showed more geometrical flair, and still others depicted various beings. It should be noted that with these lines, the Nazca once again may well be following in the footsteps of their Paracas predecessors, from whom numerous geoglyphs, these ones dug into hillsides and therefore unlike the Nazca lines visible from Earth as well, may have been found. The collection of Nazca lines are erratically placed, and new lines are drawn over older lines, perhaps reflecting the older line's function to have been wrought, or perhaps its significance faltered or waned. The most readily compelling are the animal glyphs, so let's take a look at those. A condor, a pelican, a heron, a parrot, now for some ground animals, a lizard, a monkey, and a dog. Some other notable drawings are a killer whale, a human figure, and lone hands. Nearby to the hands is a tree. Starting around 500 CE, the Nazca begin to weaken, and by around 700 CE, Nazca construction is almost entirely over, likely thanks to the encroachments of the Wari, who we'll meet soon. But before the rise of the Wari, up north around 100 CE, with the Nazca having been around for some 200 years, there arose the Moche. In the last video on South American civilization, we closed off in noting the growth of warlike settlements regularly built upon ridgetops and with defensive walls, with the wealthy living in large homes emerging starting around 500 BC in the Santa, Casma, Nepena, and Moche valleys. While these settlements show no sign of religion playing the centralizing role we'd seen with Chavin culture, they didn't have large ceremonial structures nor religious iconography, a new culture picking up around 100 CE is marked by both the prominence of war and the prominence of religion. This culture is that of the Moche, and they have large pyramidal structures as well as religious iconography. One of these pyramids, just to the south of the Moche River no less, gets the status of largest Pre-Columbian construction in South America. The Moche are also responsible for road building, with over 200 roads thus far discovered. Already earlier than the around 100 CE startup of the Moche, around 200 BC, in parts of this area are cultures that overlapped with the coming Moche, the Viru and the Recue. To the south, picking up around the same time as the Moche, around 100 CE, is the Lima culture. Moche culture is divided into northern and southern regional components. From the Nepena River up until the Chicama River is the southern Moche, and then north of the Chicama, from the Jequetepeque, then the Zana, Lambayeque, and finally the Piura rivers are the northern Moche. Debate surrounds the nature of Moche political organization, and in running with my main source's sympathies, perhaps Moche culture was composed of a number of warring city-states. Warfare and captive taking and head removal are important to them, and they created wonderfully decorated pottery, including some of the most explicit depictions of sex arriving from the ancient world. Near the mouth and on the south side of the Moche River are two pyramids, Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna. While Huaca del Sol gets the gold medal for largest Pre-Columbian South American construction, the smaller Huaca de la Luna is better preserved, and the murals left give us a sense of the way the pyramid was decorated. Of particular note are the bound captives and Ayapec, the famed Moche creator deity. Similar themes are seen at a pyramid near the Chicama River, Huaca Cao Viejo of the El Brujo complex. This is also where the Lady of Cao was found. A close-up on the elaborate dress of these warrior elite can be detected through their pottery depictions as well as through their burials. One thing that stands out to me is the repeated Tumi knife motif, where the tool they use for decapitation is found atop their heads, sometimes behind their backs, and perhaps that's what's going on with that nose piece. The ear flares, which show up often in pottery depictions, can be intricately detailed pieces. While for their violent aspect, we see in the pottery numerous depictions of warriors armed with maces and spears, decapitated heads, and bound prisoners, they also left another side of their lives behind in pottery form. Beyond their taste for blood and presumably power, sex for pleasure may well have been another valued passion, as, interestingly, much of the sexual action depicted in their art is non-vaginal, but rather manual, oral, and anal. To start, and these aren't necessarily related to the act of sex per se, there are lone figures with erect penises, often incredibly large, and figures with wide-holed vaginas. Then there are couple figures, with a woman either stimulating a man with her hand or performing fellatio. Cunnilingus isn't depicted. Suggestive of what exactly, I'm not sure, but clearly suggestive of something, some of the hand-job couple pieces show the man as a skeleton, and sometimes both of the figures are skeletons. These skeletal pieces aren't limited to sexual pieces, such as here where both of the couple figures and the child are all skeletal. Beyond utilizing hand and mouth, there are the oft anal and lesser vaginal depictions. Not wanting to leave you with the mistaken impression that the story of Moche pottery is of the warlike and sexual nature, let's briefly look at some other pieces. There is the runner motif, with figures in procession running. Naturalistic representations of human faces are also a common Moche artifact. Then there are many depictions of animals, sometimes on the surface and sometimes through the very form of the pottery piece. The same goes for vegetables. Around 800 CE, the Moche centers were abandoned, and we now move back in time and down south, going past the Nazca and heading southeast to Lake Titicaca. In the Moche's wake would arise the Sican and Chimu cultures, the latter of which would conquer the former before the Chimu themselves were taken over by the Inca, but that'll be for another time. Perhaps around 100 CE, perhaps earlier, a site that would go on to become a regional cultural influence, Tiwanaku, was founded some 15 kilometers to the south of Lake Titicaca in a wide, flat valley 3,800 meters above sea level. The population grew to over 10,000 by around 500 CE, and possibly grew to reach into the tens of thousands. Eventually, their culture began spreading and influencing other sites. The extent of influence varies, and the most influence is seen in the Moquegua Valley, relatively close by to the west of Tiwanaku. Other areas show less influence, and though a site might show as little connection as a shift in still locally produced pottery design, other sites could indicate deeper ties. Even as far south as the site San Pedro de Atacama, there's evidence for a literal presence of a more closely related to Tiwanaku non-local ethnic group comprising some part of the population. Tiwanaku itself was the great site near the northern end of their sphere of influence. In the center of Tiwanaku sat the Acapana Pyramid. The Acapana Pyramid was the largest structure at Tiwanaku. Then there's the partially reconstructed Kalasasaya, which runs some 120 by 130 meters. Standing in the middle of the Kalasasaya is the 3.5-meter tall Ponce monolith. From the nearby sunken court arrives an even larger piece, the Bennett monolith, which checks in at 7.3 meters tall. Another wonderful artifact is the so-called Gateway of the Sun, which was found cracked and semi-underground, and may have originated from the Pumapunku complex, a site associated with feasting and from where there are a number of other gateways, as well as a whoppingly weighty 130-ton stone slab. By around 1000 CE, Tiwanaku had declined. For the last culture to call our attention today, we move back north, this time to the east of the Nazca, where the site of Wari sits. Wari culture picked up around 500 CE. The Wari were responsible for building stone-paved roads, later subsumed into the Inca road system, some of them running hundreds of kilometers. Their capital was the city of Wari, located on a hilltop in the Ayachucho Valley. Wari had large walls surrounding it, and the area inside those walls, along with the area just surrounding it, came to house over 10,000 people. Agriculturally, the Wari mainly planted corn and potatoes. The Wari greatly expanded the use of terraced agriculture, and they also constructed large farms built away from the settlements. As for animal herding, mass pens sat right outside the capital's walls, as well as the walls of apparent Wari outposts. Around 650 CE, Wari cultural typology, from ceramics and textiles, and to an extent farming, mass herding, and walled cities, expanded to the north and south. Some sites were more than cultural spread, with Piquilacta in the south and Viracocha Pampa in the north being apparent Wari outposts that are modeled on the city of Wari itself. These, oft thought to be administrative centers, were fairly lightly populated. Sites like Piquilacta and Viracocha Pampa help the case for there being a Wari empire of sorts, but the extent to which the term empire is appropriate for the Wari is debated. Likely in the 900s CE, the Wari outposts are abandoned, and by around 1100 CE, possibly earlier, the capital of Wari itself had withered away.